Saturday, July 1st, 2023. I'm in my backyard in Ottawa. The air quality index is 4, but yesterday it was 7, and last week it was 10 out of 10. So we're in a ecological crisis, and it's tangible and in some ways audible as I speak, with air conditioning and purification systems going on and the world out of balance. This is the 127th episode of the Conscient Podcast, and it marks the halfway point of Season 4, which, as you might recall, is called Sounding Modernity. I've been trying to explore what modernity might sound like, how it affects us, and what we can do about it. Maybe. But at this halfway point, I've decided to look back on the first 6 months and see how it has been and where it might go from here. So a quick heads up that this episode is 57 minutes in duration, because I'm doing it as a special episode of the Framework radio program in Estonia. You'll recall that Season 1 began on January 1st with episode 101, Tension. Tension. I was thinking about the tensions in our lives and the art of finding balance points. So I went for a walk in Vancouver and came upon a piece of fishing line. I brought it in the house, strung it up, and recorded myself plucking it. Listeners might recall that each episode this season ends with a question. How do you feel now? How do you feel now is actually at the heart of this project. How does one perceive the sounds of the modern world? What about now? How does it feel like to absorb these sounds into our bodies? How can we change the way we listen? How can we move away from the madness of modernity? And if, tragically, we're unable to step away, as we seem to be these days with the wildfires across Canada, at the very least, how can we help prepare future generations for what is coming? How can art help? How can listening help? Are we helpless? Now, I've had the good fortune of receiving some very interesting responses and reactions in the first part of this season, 26 episodes so far, and also to my 6 monthly blogs. And these come in various forms and channels, some formal, some informal, verbal, written, sometimes images, sounds. For example, this poem from artist and educator Carolina Duque, also known as Azul. She submitted it on the Conscient website on January 3rd, 2023. And it's about her experience with episode 101, Tension. I'll read it for you. I walked down the sea line of San Andreas Island in the Caribbean as I listened, felt the tension. I grew up on this island. I noticed the shoreline getting smaller. I noticed the corals turning grey. I noticed the buildings growing taller. The overlapping reggaeton and vallenato music from competing speakers. I noticed everything getting louder. I noticed the tension. I noticed the menu saying, fish is scarce. I notice in my lungs the tension, in my eyes the tension, in my waves, in my feet the tension. So part of my response to Azul's comment was, I was reading Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing book today and came upon this sentence that relates to your quote, and I quote her. I hold up bioregionalism as a model for how we might begin to think again about place, end of quote. Which to me means that we need to be stewards of the land wherever we are, in collaboration with all living beings. And this idea of bioregionalism and of the local is coming back again and again in my conversations with artists and climate workers. So I've documented almost every piece of feedback that I've received from listeners and colleagues in the blog mostly on conscient.ca. And I'm very grateful for these gifts of knowledge and insight. They help me in my journey, and I hope help you as listeners have different perspectives on themes that I'm trying to explore. Now, most episodes in this podcast are about the relationship between art and the ecological crisis. You might recall episode 102, Aesthetics. The problem with beauty is that it can distract us from reality. Sit with me, please. Take a moment. Sit and listen. Now, I've also integrated soundscape compositions and layerings of sounds in most episodes in and around the narrative. So, for example, in episode 103, Heat.
This thing's smart. Everything talks to each other. I would just leave it on auto and let it choose what it wants to do.
In fact, we're listening to the heat pump as we speak to my right, doing its work of pushing heat out of our house, allowing the cold to be there. So, how do we decarbonize our lifestyles? How does one rethink the way we use energy in day-to-day life? For example, in episode 110, Drain, I improvised a poem about water.
It goes down the drain and into the sewer system to be processed and dumped into the Ottawa River. Then it evaporates into the sky and it rains back into our lakes and rivers, bringing with it many pollutants. And then it is pumped into our homes, into our bodies, and heated until it goes down the drain again and into the sewer system to be processed and dumped into the Ottawa River.
Now, a friend of mine, artist Maria Gomez, shared this response to episode 110. on March 6th. Only the water doesn't stay in the Ottawa region, as it travels south in the moistness of the clouds all the way to the Patagonia glaciers, and in ocean currents to Asia, and its skies, and then it travels up the Arctic. The water I bathe in contains my cells that are distributed all around the world, and particles from the world touch me in the water. I responded to Maria this way. It's true that water travels in us, through us, and beyond. The sound of water can either be pleasant or a signal of danger. But either way, we need to listen and understand the language of water. And I guess I would add, we also need to understand and listen to the language of air these days with the wildfires. Now, some of the episodes called upon quotes from previous episodes of this podcast, such as photographer Joan Sullivan in episode 96 from season 3, which I used an excerpt of in episode 106, Fire, from season 4.
And it suddenly dawned on me that my hands were shaking not because of the cold, but because of an anger, this deep, profound anger about our collective indifference in the face of climate breakdown. We're just carrying on with our lives as if, la la la, and nothing's bad's happening. So there was this sense of rage. I mean, honestly, it's surprising how strong it, violent rage just sort of coming out of me. I wanted to scream. And I just, took my camera and I just moved it violently, right, left, up, down, and almost, I suppose it was almost like I was drowning in the water. My arms were just doing everything. And I was holding down the shutter the whole time. 20, 30, 40 photos at a time. And I did it over and I was just beside myself. And, at some point you just stop. And, you're staring out at the river. And I just felt helpless. I just didn't know what to do.
And I do hear you, Joan. I also do not know what to do. I also called upon climate activist and politician Anjali Apatarai from episode 23 in season 2. And I used an excerpt of our conversation, which was a sound walk, in episode 114 of this season.
Privilege can go back as far as you want it to go back, right? And of course it's so nuanced, it's not every white guy has this much privilege, but you do have a privilege that goes back hundreds of years. And I think one aspect of privilege a lot of people leave out is this economic aspect, right? Of class and resources. And that to me is, it's not often talked about in the climate conversation, but it's a huge piece of it. Because when we talk about the extinction of our species, this extinction doesn't happen overnight. It happens in a spectrum. Who are the last ones standing? It's those with the most resources. Who are the first ones to go? It's those with the least, the most disenfranchised. So I don't think you can talk about climate without talking about privilege, ultimately. And I think it's on each of us to unpack that for ourselves and to bring that into the conversation.
One of the most ambitious episodes so far this season has been episode 112, Listening, which I presented as my keynote speech at the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology, WFAE, at their conference called Listening Pasts, Listening Futures in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. It runs over 10 minutes, so I broke my own rule of having only 5-minute episodes at that point. But I decided to go with the flow when episodes needed more time. Rules are arbitrary in a way, and so I decided to just take the time that was needed. So here is the final sequence from episode 112, Listening.
Conclusion 5. Connect our efforts. Todd Dufresne. Whoever survives these experiences will have a renewed appreciation for nature, for the external world, and for the necessity of collectivism in the face of mass extinction. Assad Rehman. Our goal is to keep our ideas and policies alive for when the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. George Monbiot. We have no choice but to raise the scale of civil disobedience until we have built the greatest mass movement in history.
During the performance, I walked out of the room at the Atlantic Center for the Arts and walked around the building asking that same question.
How can listening help? How can listening help? How can listening help?
Now, each episode of this season has a different aesthetic, a different style, a different approach, depending on my inspiration, my mood that week, and what I was learning or unlearning at any given moment, what I was reading, who I'd spoken with, what I felt from our environment. So, for example, some episodes featured unedited field recordings without much narration. For example, the subway in Montreal in episode 120, Metro, where I invite you, the listener, to sit with the sound and let it speak to you, as if the sound were a living entity, which I think it is.
Sometimes we just have to stop and listen without passing judgment. Just listen.
Prochaine station, Lucien Lallier. Lucien Lallier.
Another example of a field recording episode is the sound of freezing rain on a canopy of hard snow in a frozen forest, which you can hear in episode 122, Quiet. Now, I suspect this episode might seem a bit boring for some listeners because not much happens. It's very quiet. In fact, the sounds in the background here, the dripping of the water and the fan from the heat pump are louder than the sounds I recorded. But I enjoy listening to quiet spaces and tuning into the subtle sonic patterns and layering of sound and silence when I'm in the country, when I'm in the wild. And maybe you do too. When I launched Sounding Modernity in December 2022, I wrote that my intention was to address some of the causes of this massive and violent overreach of planetary boundaries, but also to explore how we can preserve some of modernity's benefits without the destruction. And of course, this is a dilemma because we actually can't have it both ways. But we think we can. So in retrospect, I realized that this goal of exploring modernity through sound was very ambitious and also pretentious and sometimes a bit naive. And I realized that failure was not only inevitable but necessary in order to explore and experience boundaries, limitations, and what the work is actually doing in terms of the listener's experience. The fan is turned off. So here's a quote from The Gift of Failure, teaching by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, which you could read the entire entry in my February blog. We choose the word gesture for the title of our collective to underscore the fact that decolonization is impossible when our livelihoods are underwritten by colonial violence and unsustainability. The food we eat, the clothes we wear, our health systems and social security, and the technologies that allow us to write about this are all subsidized by expropriation, dispossession, destitution, genocides, and ecocides. There's no way around it. We cannot bypass it. The only way is through. How we fail is important. It is actually in the moments when we fail that the deepest learning becomes possible. And that is usually when we stumble upon something unexpected and extremely useful. Failing generatively requires both intellectual and relational rigor. Now, one of my favorite failures so far in Season 4 is episode 121, Rumble, where I try to impersonate a superhero, Dr. Decibel, in Stanley Park in Vancouver. It's admittedly pretty hokey and a bit raw, but I like the way that it explores fantasy storytelling. This is Dr. Decibel, your sonic superhero on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as, well, I think you know where I am. You have a problem here, people. The low frequencies are excessive. Traffic, industry, ventilation, layers and layers of rumble, and I hate rumble. Rumble is not something I enjoy. So I'm going to use my superpowers today to reduce the amount of rumble in your city. Rumble. Another failed episode of this season was episode 118, Toilet, about shit. My intention here was to comment upon composting, both literally and figuratively. Dr. Vanessa Andreotti talks eloquently about shit in her book Hospicing Modernity, which I recommend you read. But what I did, instead of addressing the issue head-on, is to take a more easier way out, or way in. So I produced an episode with the statement, "Where does your shit go?" accompanied by 4 recordings of toilets flushing, which does not directly address the issue. I kind of copped out, but it's a start, and I think I'll come back to the issue of composting. And to be honest, I was attracted by the rich sound of the toilet, in particular when it's refilling. And I also enjoyed the silence that follows when it is full, waiting to flush again. And that made me think about the precious water that we use in this wasteful cycle of flushing away our shit. Where does your shit go? Now, sadly, on April 25th, my dear father-in-law, Robin Matthews, passed away of pancreatic cancer. His illness was on my mind throughout the first half of this season. I had the privilege and pleasure of recording him reading one of his last poems, Deeper into the Forest, in February of 2023 at his home in Vancouver. He did it in one take. I published it a couple of days before his passing and published it both in audio and in video format as episode 117, Deeper into the Forest. Here's Robin reading the end of the poem.
You know the voices, and you know they cannot shape words that will break the surface over your head. Lights flash in the skies above, dart through the water, but words do not form. The surface above you, which you cannot break through, closes. In the darkness that moves towards you, as if a living creature, the voices fade away or seem to fade away. And you know the surface above your head will not break. The voices beyond the surface will grow distant and imperfect, and you, quite alone, will move deeper into the forest.
I received many comments about this poem and this episode. Here's an example from listener Kathy Pointer, who was a former student and friend of Robin's. Here's the quote. "This is so wonderful to hear, see, feel, and read. Beautifully done, the poem, the paintings, the voice, all of the sounds. It is like reaching from beyond to tell us where and how to move through further into the depth of the forest, of reality, life, and death. I think it is very profound. It gives me hope that we must all go on this journey. He has captured the experience I feel of time and eternity." Thank you, Kathy. I also wrote a one-person play during this time called Traps, episode 111. And this episode comes from teachings, again, from the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, and explores the idea of traps in our lives. And I certainly have my share of traps that I fall into and try to get back out of. Here's the beginning of that episode. Have you ever had the feeling that you are being observed? Well, I'm observing you. Who are you and what are you observing? Well, I'm a part of you and I'm observing the traps that you tend to fall in. Traps? Do you remember the Facing Human Wrongs course you took during the summer of 2022? Yeah? The one about navigating paradoxes and complexities of social and global change and all of those trappings along the way? Yeah, I remember. Easier said than done, though. Yeah. So, what are you observing? Well, what can I say? I notice that you've fallen into a trap called, for example, exit fixation, which is where people feel a strong urge to walk out of an existing commitment. For example, when someone realizes that the path they're on is full of paradoxes, contradictions, and complicities, and often their first response is to find an immediate exit in hopes of a more fulfilling or more innocent alternative, or maybe even an ideal community with whom to continue this work. You mean like an escape? Yeah, something like that. I also had the privilege of receiving insightful feedback from listeners about the Conscient podcast as a whole. Not any one episode, but the whole trajectory of the project. And here's an example that I received on May 16th from a friend who asked to remain anonymous. So grateful to have been able to listen and stay close to your work. It's wonderful to witness, feel, and sense into the different layers and movements over the course of the episode and throughout the arc of the season so far. It's almost as if the story of sounding modernity is being stitched by the sounds, walks, and episodes, and shifting it into this surprising creature, sometimes scary, sometimes funny, sometimes invisible, sometimes fictional. I wonder what else the story of sounding modernity will further weave itself, both in and out of control, as you continue to loosen even more of your grip on it, slowly and gently. I like how humor mixes with pain and poetry, mixes with interviews, and ocean mixes with toilet shitty waters. The playful and surprising diversity is fun. It's even clear that you are both struggling and having so much fun, which adds honesty and trust in wanting to go with you on the inquiry. As you approach the middle of your journey, what might be needed at this time to invite further, and what might be ready to be released into new soils? May more sounds reveal and be revealed. I was very touched by this comment by my friend. I responded, "Your point about how sounding modernity might unfold in and out of control is a good one as I approach the midpoint of the project on July 1st. I'm coming to terms with its failings, surprises, and unanticipated unlearnings. The isolation in particular has been bewildering. I think I have already lost my grip on it, in a good way. I have essentially given up on it being an exploration of the sounds of modernity, which is quite pretentious anyway, but rather, as you suggest, it has become a portrait of my struggles and discoveries through the sounds of modernity." So let me expand a little bit on this idea of isolation, because maybe you feel something similar when you're doing your own work and you don't get as much response as you would like or hope. My hope for this project was that it might engage the arts community in dialogue with me and with each other about these existential issues. And that's why each episode ends with a question. And it's meant to be a prompt or an invitation to dialogue. But it's not meant to be a rhetorical inquiry, as some people think it is. It's an invitation. So my expectation was that it would interest artists and others with a similar frame of mind, and it has, but it has not been as generative as I thought it might be. And so I'm humbled by the fact that it's not working as well as I thought. But it has been extremely helpful to me, and I hope to others, now or later. In particular, as we deal with eco-anxiety, eco-grief, and some of those other complex issues of our times, through listening and slowing down. Here's another example of feedback I received on June 7th from Jean-Marc Lamoureux about episode 123, Maps. When it comes to unknown possibilities for humanity, it is important to acknowledge that our knowledge and understanding of the world is limited. There are areas in science, technology, philosophy, and exploration that remain largely uncharted. New discoveries, innovations, and breakthroughs are possible in these domains and could unveil unforeseen possibilities. It is also important to note that the future is uncertain, and it is challenging to accurately predict what will unfold. Technological advancements, social and political changes, as well as unforeseen events can all shape the future of humanity in unexpected ways. To address the uncertainty of the future and the challenges of the ecological crisis, it is crucial to foster an open, inclusive, and collaborative approach, encouraging research, innovation, and exploration across relevant fields, as well as promoting sustainability, environmental conservation, and social justice are all essential. We must also recognize that the future of humanity is closely intertwined with our relationship with the earth and the other living beings that inhabit it. Taking care of our planet and living in harmony with nature. Thank you for your attention and for engaging in deep reflection on these important questions. So I responded to Jean-Marc the following. I agree that we need to keep a positive attitude and that there is much that we do not know. I quote writer Rebecca Solnit in episode 19, who said, "Hope locates itself in the premise that we do not know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act." My point in episode 123 was to share my stress, and I guess my distress, about where we are going at this time and where we might be going. What concerns me most is our deep disconnection with nature, which has been in the works for centuries and, I think, is killing us all. So, Jean-Marc, I don't think innovation will help if it is built on a self-destructive model. But certainly, doomism does not help. Neither does naive hope. So here we are, July 1st, 2023. It's 8:30 in the morning. I'm halfway through this project. 28 done, 25 to go. What's next? Well, to be honest, and I admitted this in episode 123 Maps, I don't really know. So these are the 5 elements of my map: mitigation, adaptation, tipping point, survival, and recovery. But the problem is that I'm wrong. The map is wrong. The truth is, I don't know. There are endless possibilities and dimensions that I'm not yet able to conceive or understand, and yet, sometimes, somehow, I can feel them. So I'm done with drawing maps and speculating with thoughts and ideas, and instead, I'm going to listen to the intelligence of my own body, to the intelligence of non-human beings around me, and to other forms of knowledge and being that are emerging, and see where that takes me. I thought of erasing all the episodes and returning the funds to the Canada Council and becoming a monk or a hermit. I expressed this sadness and grief at the end of my June blog as follows. I was reminded today of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective SMDA compass teaching about how we walk a tightrope between desperate hope and reckless hopelessness. It's a fine line, but these days I've fallen into a deep cavern of hopelessness, but not yet recklessly. And the issue of hope will come back again and again in this season and in this podcast. Now, speaking of erasure, I noticed recently that Catherine Ingram, the brilliant Buddhist scholar and philosopher who has deeply influenced me in my learning and unlearning journey, wrote on her website in reference to her seminal essay, Facing Extinction, that I wrote the long-form essay Facing Extinction in early 2019. Over these past years, I have occasionally been able to update the information and perspectives contained therein. However, I'm finding that the speed with which the data is changing and the pressure and the pressing issues that we are immediately facing, such as the exponential rise of artificial intelligence and transhumanism, have made some of this essay obsolete. I have thus decided to remove it. Now, this is very interesting for me because Catherine's essay is really well thought through and expresses where we are at today very, very clearly. So I hope Catherine will bring back some of the essay and just continue her work. And I wanted to refer back to episode 19 where I quote, Facing Extinction. Love. What else is there to do now? Here we are, some of the last humans who will experience this beautiful planet since Homo sapiens began their journey some 200,000 years ago. Now, in facing extinction of our species, you may wonder if there's any point of going on. And I think you're right, Catherine, that love is what we must do and be. It might be all that we can do and be. Where do we go from here? Is there any point of going on? What do you think? And maybe more importantly, how do you feel now? So, after quite a bit of thought, I decided to finish what I started and continue every Sunday to publish an episode until I get to episode 153 on December 31st. And see where it takes me, where it takes us in this learning and unlearning journey. There's a plane. There was bound to be one, since I'm outdoors here today. What can I learn and unlearn as I go forward? What can I do to slow down and undo some of the damage? These are ongoing questions. I'm actually quite excited about part 2 of season 4. In particular, I want to explore the idea of inviting listeners differently and how to release materials into new soils. Thankfully, I haven't had to do this work alone. I've had the privilege of working with a number of great collaborators, including content advisors Azul Carolina Duque and Flora Aldrich, translator Carole Beaulieu, communications advisors Jessica Reno and Ben Van Wong, web designer Aisha Barmania, and countless friends and colleagues who have provided feedback and support. Thank you all for your input and your trust. So this is the end of episode 127, as the plane flies by. I'll leave you with an excerpt from an upcoming episode. Doesn't have a title yet, but I recorded in Vancouver, and it's about the sounds of Vancouver that have disappeared And I think that's an interesting issue to think about. Not only what does modernity sound like, but what do we want the world to sound like in the future? Thanks for listening, and take care. and sync point. Go.